Good evening, and a very warm welcome to everyone joining us this evening for our Remembering Ruth event 40 years on. Yes, it's 40 years since the death of Ruth Hayman in 1981. And tonight we'll be paying tribute to this amazing woman in whose name this charity was founded. And we're honoured that we have our distinguished patron, Lord Peter Hayne, whose parents knew Ruth, and also colleagues of Ruth and members of her family who'll be joining us. And at the end of the programme, I'll be updating you on the work of the Trust and how you can support the Trust by perhaps making a regular payment. But first, I'd like to introduce you to Natasha Hayman, or Tash, who is the great niece of Ruth Hayman. We're really fortunate to have wonderful support from the Hayman family, and I was absolutely delighted when Tash joined us. I think it was 3 years ago as a trustee, and she's been working incredibly hard ever since. So I'll pass over to you, Tash, to take us through the first part of the programme.
Great, thanks, Mary. And a very warm welcome to everyone who's joining us tonight. So as Mary said, Ruth was my great aunt, but sadly she died before I was born, so I never got the pleasure of meeting her. Through working with the Ruth Hayman Trust, though, I've got to know a little bit about the kind of woman she was. Ruth spent her life challenging injustice and taking practical action to make change. And I think if the dedication of the trustees that I work with and our wonderful supporters is anything to go by, she must have been a pretty incredible person. I first got involved with the Trust through attending some of their events, and I was instantly inspired by their mission to empower people, refugees, asylum seekers, other people making the UK their home through giving grants for education and skills. It was always really powerful to hear from beneficiaries. So there's one story that particularly stuck with me, which was of a Sri Lankan doctor who'd been working in a bakery for many years until the Trust had given him a grant so that he could retrain as a doctor in the UK. And he went on to work for the NHS. And I particularly like that story because to me it exemplified that this isn't just about helping individuals, it's about the kind of benefits that this gives to all of us and to our society. So yeah, justice, inclusion, opportunity, these are principles that I feel like Ruth lived by, and she demonstrated in all the work that she did in her life. So a few years later, I was invited to become a trustee. So the charity's run without any paid staff. So it's just the trustees that run the charity. And for the last few years, that's been a really important part of my life and a really nice way of honouring my great aunt's memory as well. So tonight we're going to get to hear all about the life and work of Ruth Hayman, from her days fighting apartheid in South Africa to becoming a pioneer for English language provision for adults in the UK. Thanks very much for joining us, especially our supporters. Without you, we wouldn't be here. And I hope that this event inspires you to continue your journey with us or to start a journey with us so that we can keep Ruth's legacy going for the next 40 years and beyond. So for our first speaker, I'd like to introduce another Hayman, my Aunt Louise, who's going to give her personal reflections about her Aunt Ruth.
Thanks, Tash. Ruth would have been very proud of you continuing her legacy of being active and caring and principled. I'm here to tell you a little bit about Ruth, not the Ruth you're going to hear about more later on, the fearless activist, gifted and principled attorney, determined campaigner, but the Ruth who is so central to my life. And in fact, it's a child eye view. I spoke at her memorial service 40 years ago and was touched to be asked to say a bit today. 40 years, it's unbelievable. My father, her brother John, who's 103 now, is joining in this meeting today to remember Ruth with the rest of us. And he's fed into what I'm saying. He's now been without his beloved sister for so much, 40 years of his long life. And it's so tragic. Her life was cut short. Who knew who knows what she might have done next. So she was my aunt, my godmother, which is an odd concept for those like her on the Jewish side of my family, but I always regarded her as my special person. Ruth saw that for a child in a large family, there's 6 of us, that's exactly what the child needed. She was the focus of so many stories and family fables, and she took on Olympian proportions in my mind. In fact, I was always surprised by how small she was when I saw her in person. She was my father's favourite sister, and their joint tennis parties at the large and welcoming family home in Johannesburg, the Angles, they were legendary. She wore trousers, smoked as a woman, and well before it was anything like the norm, she hosted dinners at the house with people of colour. Later on, as we grew older, my siblings and I became aware of her contentious political and legal activities and how my father worried about her. And when the news broke that she had suddenly been exiled for life from her country, the media gathered outside my father's barrister's chambers in the Temple in London trying to get a statement from him. Now, anyone who knows the cloistered calm of the Inns of Court will appreciate what a rupture in normality this was. Not the only one she created, of course. She arrived in the UK the next day, and sure enough, life was never the same. In particular, Sundays at our home in Kew was a special day, and Ruth was always at the heart of things. She'd come over from Hampstead, often brought many friends to lunch, including colleagues from the anti-apartheid struggle, like Peter Hain, his parents, Walter and Ad, Albie Sachs, later a justice on the Constitutional Court in South Africa, and many others, activists, ex-prisoners, artists, writers, political figures. The house rang with conversation and debate, and you can imagine how heady that was for us. But at some point in every day that she was there, Ruth would always come and find me and ask about my life and interests. She'd give me a book or 10, and they were all intoxicatingly just beyond my understanding. She was endlessly curious and always interested in everything, and I think that's really what I remember most keenly about her. Of course, her fierce intelligence and unceasing energy could make her a bit scary for us as children. So I was amused to find out she wasn't always this force, and in relation to her own formidable mother. I found family letters from the 30s that my grandmother wrote home while she was off making idealistic fact-finding trips to socialist paradises like Russia or Zionist farms in Palestine. Letters which abruptly changed tone as they descended into irascible PSs. Ruth, where is my dry cleaning? Ruth, do not forget to contact Mrs. X. So my grandfather was a corporate lawyer in Johannesburg, and my father an English barrister and later judge. But Ruth was every thrilling and important thing you could be as a lawyer. And she was a key inspiration in my becoming a lawyer. And in my professional career as a freedom of expression lawyer, I consciously followed in those footsteps in my own way. At the memorial service, my father said about her, Ruth was everything one's oldest sibling should be: friend, mentor, confidant, generous in spirit and in kind. At previous 10-year anniversaries of Ruth's death, I've put an in memoriam notice into the Times as the establishment paper rather than her chosen reading material. And I put it there to pay tribute to her impact on my and so many other lives. And it quotes the lovely words by Alan Paton. She was one of the brave champions, and the gods love them.
Thank you, Louise. That was really, really lovely. Thank you for sharing those lovely memories of Ruth. A very special way to start the event.
Thank you.
So our next speaker is someone that Louise mentioned, who is now one of our esteemed patrons, and that is Lord Peter Hain, someone who you may know as a former MP and a Labour minister who had a dramatic political career from South Africa to the UK, and has just written a new book about that that's called A Pretoria Boy. So Peter's parents, your parents were anti-apartheid activists. Welcome, Peter, and good friends of Ruth. And we're so delighted that you've joined us tonight to reflect a bit on their work and your experiences. So yeah, thank you so much. And would you like to tell us a bit about your memories of Ruth and your early experiences in South Africa?
Well, Tash, thank you very much for inviting me, and good evening, everybody. It's a real privilege and honor for me to be supporting the Ruth Hayman Trust and to have been invited to be a patron and all the wonderful work you do. And that story about the Sri Lankan doctor or baker turned doctor turned baker turned doctor is really inspiring, as it was listening to Louise. My recollection of Ruth is as a young boy, in early teens and then into my mid-teens, because she, along with my mum and dad, Adeline and Walter Hayne, was amongst a tiny 0.01% of the white population in South Africa under apartheid, who took a stand and fought against that evil institutionalized system of racism, the worst the world has ever seen. And her bravery ranked alongside anybody in the anti-apartheid struggle. Obviously, there are the iconic heroes, the Nelson Mandelas, the Oliver Tambos, the Chris Hanis, the Ahmed Kathradas, the Rivonia trialists, all those incredible men and women as well, who often don't get as much of a mention, the Adelaide Tambos, the Winnie Mandelas, and Albertina Sisulu, amongst many others. So my mum and dad were close friends and fellow comrades of Ruth's in the South African Liberal Party, which at the time they were most under siege from the apartheid state in the early 60s, and we had special branch cars parked at the bottom of our drive, constantly placing us under surveillance, raiding the house. And Ruth and her husband Merv, who I remember well too, were at the center of that kind of sense of siege as well. And I remember Ruth as a very tenacious lawyer, and I'll come back to that because it's central to her story and her exile, as it was to my own parents. Always seemed to be smoking with a very unpolitically correct today, with a husky voice, as I recall, and small, diminutive, formidable, indomitable, as I recall it. Very friendly, however, to us kids, and a warm, caring person, and yet a highly able professional. And she, of course, was then, as John Harris's lawyer, John being a fellow Liberal Party activist. And I should say, by the way, that at this stage in the early 1960s, the Liberal Party was the only anti-apartheid organization genuinely committed to one person, one vote, to universal franchise, the only legal anti-apartheid organization committed to true non-racialism. There were others. There was Helen Suzman's Progressive Party, and Helen, of course, played a notable role in the anti-apartheid fight. But they were committed to a qualified franchise. The Liberal Party of South Africa was the only universal one person, one vote, genuinely non-racial party. And as such, it was the only legal one, because by that time the ANC and other anti-apartheid resistance forces such as the PAC had been banned. And so they were really on the front line, my mom and dad, Ruth and others. And it all came to a head after my parents had been banned, my mother first, and then my dad second. Previously, they'd been jailed when I was 11 years old, and even my younger brother and sisters even younger. And it all came to a head when their friend from the Liberal Party, friend and activist, and former chair of the South African Non-Racial Olympic Committee, pressing for white South Africa's expulsion from the Olympics, for which he was banned, John Harris, a sports activist banned for his sports activity rather than his political activity. John was a close friend and fellow activist. And then in 1964, having joined the African resistance movement, a group committed to sabotage of government installations out of desperation that the resistance had been smashed. Leading Liberal Party members had been banned, including my parents, some house arrested, some, as Ruth, of course, eventually was. House arrest meant you couldn't leave your home outside working hours, and you had to report once a week to the local police station. So effectively, you were imprisoned in your own house over weekends, and between, I think it was 6 at night and 6 in the morning, you could work, and that was the only time you were permitted to join more than one other person at a time was at work, because a banning order, Ruth was banned, a house arrest even more stringent, meant you couldn't socialize with anybody other than one other person. By the way, there's a funny side to that Orwellian predicament. When my mother was banned a year earlier than my dad, and one of the many clauses in a banning order was you could not communicate with another banned person. When they banned my dad, this presented the government with a big dilemma and an embarrassment, because they'd never had a banned married couple before, so they had to give them special permission exceptionally to communicate with one other banned person on the planet, namely each other. So there was that, as I say, Orwellian side to it all. But John Harris joined the African resistance movement along with other young liberal activists and radicals, joined by socialists and Trotskyists and communists and ANC members as well, of all colors, outside the Liberal Party. But there was a core of liberals involved as well. Very controversial, because the Liberal Party officially disavowed such action, but they felt it was out of desperation. And John Harris then took an act which he was a teacher, by the way, a young teacher, married to Anne Harris, a young teacher as well. Lovely bloke. I knew him well as a kid, very enthusiastic about sport, close friend of Ruth. And he was arrested after having been banned for planting a bomb on Johannesburg railway station. He'd intended that act as a spectacular demonstration of desperation against apartheid that would, he thought, bring attention and ignite resistance, which had been crushed. Mandela and his comrades then being on Robben Island. He telephoned a 15-minute warning asking for the station concourse to be cleared and the suitcase he'd left there containing the ticking bomb to be left on its own with nobody present. That warning was deliberately ignored. It was revealed in court at his trial that he had issued that 15-minute warning. There was no question about it. It was deliberately ignored. It went right up to John Foster, the Minister of Justice, so-called Minister of Police and Security, subsequently Prime Minister, and by the way, in parenthesis, during the Second World War, interned for pro-Nazi activities. So you get the kind of idea of what apartheid rulers were like, and there were many of them active in the resistance against the Allies and in support of the Nazis during the Second World War. They were cut from the same cloth. John was, as I say, arrested. Ruth became his lawyer, was one of the first allowed to see him, discovering that he was in a terrible state. His jaw had been broken. He was bleeding and so on. And she represented him. And you can just imagine, and this shows her courage. And my parents as well stood by him, and his wife took his wife and toddler son David in to stay with us so that she could visit. My mum used to drive her to prison to take food parcels to John and other detainees every day. And it was a tough time. And Ruth suffered a great deal of persecution because she was John Harris's lawyer, and he was by then the devil incarnate, especially when he was put on trial and it became public. So Ruth was right at the center of this firestorm. And to cut the story of John Harris short, he was sentenced to death. Ruth was part of the appeal process, which failed. She was then part of appeals internationally to try and fight for his life. And she actually flew to London to try and persuade John Harris's fellow conspirator, John Lloyd, to retract his evidence. And that evidence was crucial to the sentence of death and John's eventual execution, because John Lloyd had planned the station bombing with John Harris, then turned state witness, and not only gave details of their joint project, but actually said in a direct lie that it had been premeditated murder. And Louise, as a lawyer, and any other lawyers present will understand the lethal significance of that, quite literally, because it would have otherwise been manslaughter or homicide or something like that. But John Lloyd gave the only evidence that it was premeditated murder for an event that he had jointly planned with John, and it wasn't, or he wouldn't have telephoned that 15-minute warning. Anyway, he was executed, and he was hung by the neck, a grisly routine I describe, I think, for the first time at the Pretoria Gallows in my book you kindly mentioned, Tash, A Pretoria Boy, South Africa's Public Enemy #1, which was the label given to me in the height of the anti-apartheid sports struggle. And he was the only white to be hung, and over 100 black political activists were hung, and hundreds of black criminals were in that same grisly gallows procedure. And it was a result of that Ruth herself was banned and house arrested for being John Harris's lawyer and for courageously standing by him and discharging her professional duty in the diligent and very effective way that she always did. And it was that forced my mom and dad to come into exile, effectively being completely ostracized, both professionally in their jobs and in every other way, and harassed. And that was a traumatic experience for us as a family. We didn't want to leave. It was a traumatic experience for Ruth and her husband Merv and their family. They didn't want to leave either. I just mention in passing, because I think it does underline the ordeal and the trauma that Ruth went through. Merv and her son Alan, it's my age, an incredible young guy, hugely talented, much brighter, always did much better at school than I did. A very talented cricketer in particular, much better cricketer than me, committed suicide in Britain. Now, the family will know more about that, but I attribute it primarily to the trauma of exile. And I just think it's important to note, because it's relevant to the Ruth Hayman Trust and supporting very often people in exile fleeing injustice to learn the English language here in Britain. Exile is a very traumatic experience, and that's true for many exiles right across the world, and no more so than those who had to come mainly to London, but not exclusively from the anti-apartheid struggle. And Alan's suicide is testimony to that. I think I'll leave it there, except to say that it was a wonderful experience to know Ruth, albeit as a teenager, and she was a very close friend of my mom and dad, who've sadly now passed as well. And their bravery should inspire all of us, and their courage and their sense of principle and sense of duty as well. I mean, these are old-fashioned terms: duty and self-sacrifice and commitment to morality and integrity and social justice and human rights. But those were very much the values that Ruth lived and acted out her life by, and I cherish the memory of her. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. Yeah, very moving to hear about that, and yeah, it brings it to life what a sort of difficult challenging time that would have been. I hope we've got time for me to ask you a couple of questions. I'm going to sneak in anyway. I guess something I wanted to ask you is, how did you feel as a young person at that time? It sounds like it must have felt like quite a doomed situation in some ways, but did you have hope that things would change? And do you think that kind of Ruth and your parents also had that hope?
Yes, we did. We always thought apartheid would be defeated, but we thought it would take a long, long time. My dad, especially, who was always quite phlegmatic and realistic about these things, said, you know, when we came into exile in 1966, in our case, I think Ruth maybe was roughly around the same time, Ruth and Merv and family. You know, it was a tough time, but we always felt we would win, but we thought it would take a long time. And that was just not, as it were, the optimism of the campaigners, because you have to be incredibly optimistic to be of the frame of mind to taking on that kind of struggle. And don't underestimate the extent of the police state. It was one of the most brutal police states, not just a system of racism that covered everything in law from sex to sport in terms of dividing and segregating and oppressing the majority of people, but it had a brutal police state underpinning it, and Ruth and Merv found themselves the victims of that, as did my own parents and both our families. But I think both I think both Ruth and my parents would say that they were foot soldiers in the anti-apartheid struggle. They were not the kind of iconic heroes. I think myself that they underestimate their role and their importance. And I'm sure she would have been proud of the South Africa's constitution being a lawyer, which is probably the finest constitution in the world, even if the country has suffered grievously under former President Zuma and the aftermath of corruption and money laundering and looting that he presided over.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Peter. It's been really great to hear about some of that background, and I think a very kind of inspiring plug for your book as well. Which I think I'd love to ask you more about how this has inspired you in your career, but I think
we're out of time.
That maybe
well, it explains pretty well everything that I subsequently did in politics. It was in my DNA, and it was inspirational people like Ruth who are part of that.
That's great. Cool. Thank you so much. Really appreciate you joining us. I think just to sort of bring in another perspective, I'm going to do a really short reading from someone else who knew Ruth in South Africa, a man called Alan Payton, who was also involved in the Liberal Party that Peter mentioned. And this is a little extract from his autobiography. And in this book, he describes how Ruth secured the release of a female activist from prison. And it's set in South Africa in the 50s and written in the 80s. So these are Alan's words. As far as I can see, Ruth knew no fear, though I don't suppose that was so. She was certainly one of the bravest women that I have ever known. She was not beautiful, but she was gifted with an extraordinary vitality that set her face alight. She took her duties as a lawyer very seriously and would confront any person or any authority in the pursuit of justice. She was one of the brightest ornaments of the party. Great. So now we're going to have a video contribution from Ruth's daughter, Janet, which I think will bring together some of the history that we've just been hearing about, and also, of course, the family perspective as well.
On behalf of my brother Peter in Canada and myself, I'm honored to speak on this online event celebrating the life of our mother, Ruth Heyman. We feel that there are many essential things about this exceptional woman that need to be remembered. During the 1950s and 1960s, we, her children, witnessed her untiring, selfless, and dedicated involvement in her work as an anti-apartheid defense lawyer in South Africa. Ruth believed that everyone was entitled to a defense, regardless of their color, creed, background, or financial status, and never turned anyone away. I know intimately what she and our family paid for her unwavering dedication to the anti-apartheid cause. We were very close, not just mother and daughter, but also good friends. My time with her was precious, and I often went to her legal rooms after school so we could drive home together and talk. In May 1966, she was served with banning orders, placed under house arrest from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., and ordered to report to the local police station once a week to check that she was still in the country. The banning order forbade her being with more than 2 people at a time, because this constituted a crowd. In addition, she could not meet with any band or political person at all. If she violated her banning orders, she could be arrested. It affected her private life. Friends and family could no longer come into our house. Only immediate family and my then fiancé were permitted to be in the same room with her. She could only attend our wedding with special permission from the magistrate. But it was a very happy day for her to be with her friends and family she had not met for months. For a woman who was so sociable, loved entertaining, going to concerts and theatre, it was both soul-destroying and humiliating, and it had an enormous impact on us, her immediate family. Was she scared? Yes. Always under surveillance, she took no chances. She was courageous, never complained, and never felt sorry for herself. She suffered the consequences of her beliefs. Owing to the stress, her health deteriorated, and regrettably, soon after our wedding, at the end of 1966, she left South Africa for London on a one-way exit permit. And because the apartheid government had revoked her passport, she could never return. She missed South Africa terribly, particularly the evocative smell of the bushveld. Once in the United Kingdom, she began a new, non-political life, dedicating her inimitable energy to the welfare of others. Her work in establishing neighborhood English classes reflects only a part of who she really was. The amazing work she did in London, and which is being honored in this event, was inspired both by her legal dedication in South Africa, as well as from the Jewish tradition of fighting for the oppressed. As instructed by Psalm 82, defend the weak and the fatherless, uphold the cause of the poor and oppressed. We are delighted that her name is being honored and remembered through the work of the Ruth Heyman Trust. Thank you.
Oh, I think I was muted there. I was just saying that was really lovely to be able to hear from Janet. So yeah, thank you very much, Janet, for sharing that with us. I'm now going to hand over to my fellow trustee, Francis, who's going to begin the next section of the event. And we're going to learn more about Ruth's contribution when she came to the UK, and also a little bit more about the Ruth Heyman Trust as well. So over to Francis.
Oh, good evening, friends. Now, if Ruth Heyman were nothing else, she was resilient. After surviving those harrowing times in apartheid South Africa, she arrived in Britain in the mid-60s as a political exile. as a former lawyer, her compassion and innate energy forced her to seek a new role in her new country. Nothing ordinary, mind, because Ruth was a determined visionary. For instance, when she learned that many immigrant women were isolated from the rest of the community, she realized the reason: they couldn't speak adequate English. So, never less than hands-on, Ruth enrolled at International House to learn how to teach English to adults. She was a very practical person. She joined Catherine Hallgarten to kickstart neighbourhood English classes, personally teaching the class in Kentish Town. And that's where I became her first classroom volunteer. Ruth radiated magnetic force. That's, I think, a way of putting it. Rapidly, she and Catherine attracted a bunch of like-minded followers, and before long, there were 118 neighbourhood English classes spread across North London. Ruth exuded charm. Yes, charm, lots of it, but also guile. She wanted people to experience the experience. Seeking funds for organising English classes, she applied to a venerable City of London charitable foundation. Now, you have to picture a bowler-hatted executive seated on a minuscule classroom chair, observing a class of immigrant women learning English in an infant school. Of course, she won him over, or on second thoughts, perhaps, he didn't want to repeat the uncomfortable experience. As well as an adept fundraiser, she was also an excellent diplomat, and she managed to forge many useful alliances. She built bridges to local community relations committees, various institutes of education, and even persuaded the Hong Kong government to fund classes in London's Chinatown. Ruth was utterly resourceful. For her, there were no problems, only solutions. If women brought infants or small children to classes, she arranged child helpers for the class. For immigrant husbands, she arranged work-seeking classes. For disabled people and carers, she initiated home tutor schemes. She even introduced specialists to produce tailor-made teaching materials. She had an eagle eye for talent. Recognizing the need for publicity, she brought in Rose Grant, a local journalist, who immediately signed on as a volunteer and then signed on forever. But that's another story. No surprise, Ruth was an inspiring leader. With regular Saturday morning sessions, she made certain that her team was always well versed in the latest teaching methods. And she was relentless. Only weeks before she died, she told me she'd received a request from an organisation to start a health project for women. Would I get involved? Already overloaded, I refused. No, I said emphatically. However, later, when sorting through papers after her death, I uncovered a copy of a letter to that organisation stating, "My colleague, Frances Weinreich, would be more than happy to find out more about the project." Frankly, Ruth was possibly the most obstinate person I've ever met. Yes, was the only answer she ever expected. After Ruth died, I took over and as chair completed the job of handing over the schemes that she'd started to various local organizations. Miraculously, over 40 years later, the majority still are going strong. As I've outlined, Ruth was resilient, a determined visionary, compassionate, practical, magnetic, charming, diplomatic, resourceful, relentless, and obstinate. But never forget, she was also cultured, sophisticated, and immensely entertaining. Is it surprising that she changed so many lives she touched? And is anyone surprised that she totally changed my life, for which I'm eternally grateful? Thank you, Ruth. And now it's my pleasure to introduce the president of the Ruth Hayman Trust, someone I've worked with for 40 years, Sheila Rosenberg, who will take the story from its North London beginnings to the rest of the UK. Over to you, Sheila.
As I said, Ruth then became a national figure. How she did it is my job to describe. Between the late 1960s and the mid-1970s, language schemes like neighbourhood English classes sprang up all over the country, quite often run by local community relations councils. And by 1977, I myself was running an ILEA language scheme in Lambeth. I had heard about Ruth's pioneering work north of the river, but the first time I actually saw her was at an Asian women's conference where she sat on her own at the back of the auditorium, quietly knitting a violent purple garment. We actually began to work together in 1977. The BBC was preparing Parosi, a programme to teach English at home. The BBC ran 2 national conferences and invited all the language organisers to attend. Delegates at both conferences agreed unanimously to set up a national organisation. And this happened in February 1978 in Birmingham. Delegates reluctantly abandoned the title NAILS, National Association of English Language Scheme, with its tough connotation, to Natesla so that individuals could join. Ruth played an absolutely vital role in all this. She drafted the Constitution, well, you might expect that, and then as secretary ensured that the meetings were properly prepared, ran smoothly, and were well minuted. But above all, she helped to establish the rigorous professional and political aims, anti-racist aims, of the new organisation. There was no sentimental do-gooding patronage for Ruth. I vividly remember the board meetings in her elegant flat in Lawn Road, with its stunning collection of pictures and delicious lunches. But with all her strength and drive, Ruth never attempted to take over this new organisation. We knew she could be fierce, but in the Tesla, she remained more in the background, still knitting as she tirelessly worked for us. We also have vivid memories of her eccentricity. Sheila Dunman, the first treasurer, remembers a drive up Oxford Street. That's when you could still do that. Ruth drove with no regard for any other traffic, and we ended up alongside a bus that was in a traffic queue. We were in an illegal lane. The very large black driver leant out of his window, looked down on Ruth and said, "You are a silly old cow, aren't you?" To which Ruth said, "Yes, I am." So they both laughed, and we went on our way just as erratically. More seriously, I was the second chair of Natesla. I enormously valued her support, and I learned a lot from her. And not just about setting up organizations and running meetings briskly and productively. On one long Natesla train journey, she once urged me to be careful not to neglect my children by always being out at meetings. My own 3 boys would have echoed that. The fact that the organization, Natesla, which is now Natekla, has survived, thrived, maintained its independence, and is now consulted by government departments is in no small part due to the high established standards that she established. It has always worked to establish high professional levels, represent the needs of students, and has fought inequality and prejudice. It was the recognition of the value of Ruth's contribution that led to the unanimous decision on her death in 1981 to set up the Ruth Hayman Trust. And I'm handing you over now to Mary to talk about what the Trust is doing now.
Thank you very much, Sheila. Well, the Trust has been flourishing now for nearly 40 years, and I hope Ruth would have been proud of what we've been doing in her name. The actual aims of the Trust haven't changed at all. We provide educational grants for adults who've come here to settle in the UK and who have English as a second language. And as Tash mentioned, we still have no paid staff. All the work is done by the trustees. And that means our overheads are incredibly low. Last year, 99% of what we raised went directly to our beneficiaries. So I feel really proud of that, and I'm sure Ruth would have been too. But what has changed is the amount of money we give away. For example, in 2008, that's about 17 years ago, we gave £13,000 away in that year. Whereas last year we gave 90,000, so 90, which is quite a big increase because fees for further and higher education have gone up hugely. So fundraising is absolutely key for us. So last year we gave 204 grants, mostly for fees, but some for books and for essential equipment. We gave 48 grants for ESOL, English for Speakers of Other Languages, mainly to asylum seekers. And some courses for ESOL cost as much as £350 a term, which is way beyond the reach of an asylum seeker, as you can imagine. The rest of the grants were for vocational courses. For example, we gave 35 grants to people who were training to work as doctors, nurses, care workers, dentists, so in health. And other grants went to a range of subjects, accounting, security, door supervisors courses, computing, interpreting, hairdressing and barbering, and many, many, many more. So most of our successful applicants have come here to seek sanctuary as refugees and asylum seekers. So last year that was 83% of the total. And last year they came from 52 different countries, with Syria being, most came from Syria. Use of computers has changed things from Ruth's time. Applicants used to write a handwritten application and post it to our PO box, but now practically all applications are online. And our grants are now paid directly to colleges by bank transfer, whereas we used to pay them by cheque to the applicant. So funnily enough, all this computing work, etc., hasn't made things that much easier. We still have lots of queries and emails because our applicants don't have easy lives and things don't always go in a straightforward way for them. But it also means we have lots of really lovely thank you letters. I'm going to give you just 2 examples. Okay, one from an Iraqi woman awarded £1,000 towards a level 6 diploma in interpreting. And she said, thank you so much for your help. I am really grateful for all of you. I am crying from happiness. I want to shake your hand one by one. And here's another one, short and sweet, from a refugee from the Ivory Coast, awarded funds for a security training course. Thank you very much, dear Ruth Heyman. God bless you, Ruth. And our grants really do help to change lives. I'll give you one example. This is from a recent successful applicant who was awarded £1,000 towards a course in law to become a solicitor. And she was also awarded £500 for the special Rose Grant Award. As Francis was saying, Rose Grant was the first chair of NATECLA. And this award is for academic excellence, but also for a special contribution towards human rights or the community. So this woman was a judge in Turkey, and her husband was a judge too. And they both worked for human rights, but fell foul of the regime, suffered terrible political persecution. Her husband was put in prison and is still there today. And she fled to the UK with her 2 young children. And she was awarded, first she came in as an asylum seeker and then gained refugee status. So she applied to us last year and was awarded £1,000 to do a course to work as a solicitor here. This was a theoretical course. And she passed with flying colours, got a distinction. And then she applied again for the final stage, which is the practical part, and was successful. So I'll read to you what she said. My biggest dream is to be a solicitor in the UK and specialise in human rights and immigration law. Because of being profoundly motivated by an interest particularly stemming from the dramatically increasing human rights abuses in Turkey, which lots of victims, including also my family, were subjected. I'm totally sure that I have the dedication required to succeed on this course, and also know I have to do this because I have no other choice in order to get back on my feet. If you award me, I assure you, you will not regret it, and I will not let you down. So I'm really sure that she won't. And now I'd like to read a message from our patron Shabibi Shah, who is a former trustee and refugee from Afghanistan and has been an amazing fundraiser from the trust. Shabibi's really sorry she can't be with you tonight, but I'm proud to read what she said. It's a great honour for me to have been a Ruth Heyman trustee and now a patron, and I know that the grants for education can really change lives. When I came here as a refugee from Afghanistan, life was so difficult. My husband was ill and I couldn't speak English. Visits to the doctor, dentist, and optician were a nightmare, and even shopping in the market was awful. And I couldn't make friends because I didn't have the language to socialize. But learning English and doing interpreting and bilingual counseling courses opened so many doors for me. Without that, I wouldn't have been able to do all the charity work I've done as an interpreter and for many charities for Afghan people, as well as for the Ruth Heyman Trust. and give something back to the country that granted refuge to me and my family. For many of those seeking refuge here, such as those fleeing from the Taliban in Afghanistan today, education can provide real hope for the future. But without help from organisations like the Ruth Hayman Trust, many refugees like me cannot afford the high fees colleges charge nowadays. So I really hope you'll be able to help the Trust continue the amazing work in Ruth's name. So a big thank you to Shabibi. And to continue the work in Ruth's name, tonight we're appealing for regular donations to the Trust to help us plan for the future. It is incredibly helpful if you can give a small amount, say every month, that we can rely on to plan. And it's easy to do via CAF Donate. Just as you can see, there's the link there, but you can find it also on our website. There's a button there. So that would be fantastic. But I'd also like to tell you about our next fundraising, which is the Big Give Christmas Challenge, which is our major fundraising event of the year, when donations will be doubled. It's during a week, the end of November, the 30th of November to the 7th of December. And this year, altogether, we're hoping to raise £12,000. So if we can manage to reach £6,000 in that week through donations from people like you, we will then get double the money, so 12,000. So hang on to your donations, your one-off donations for the moment, and we'll be sending a link around. It's not till it's midday on the 30th of November. And please do give us a donation then, and it would be fantastically helpful. And let's hope we can reach our target. So thank you to everybody who's taken part today, and also to everybody involved in this tribute to Ruth. And I hope it's inspired some of you to support the Ruth Hayman Trust. So that's goodbye. And I'd like to hopefully to the other people who contributed, for us all to say goodbye and thank you to everybody.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.